To truly understand the Edo period in Japan, one must peel back the vibrant layers of samurai lore and geisha mystique and delve into the decidedly unglamorous, yet utterly essential routines that underpinned daily life. Among these, the public bathhouse or sento stands as a testament to the period's social fabric, its hygienic practices, and the intricate division of labor that sustained its bustling cities. And within the humid, steamy confines of these establishments, an often overlooked figure played a pivotal role: the senyo, or bathhouse woman. It is through her lens, a lens clouded by steam and the endless scrub of worn brushes, that we can begin to grasp the sheer physical and social demands of an ordinary day in Edo. Imagine, if you will, the early hours of a winter morning in Edo, perhaps 1750. The city is still largely dormant, the charcoal braziers of most homes barely flickering to life. Yet in the bathhouses, activity has already begun. The senyo would be among the first to arrive, often before dawn, her breath misting in the cold air as she slipped through the sliding doors of the sento. The main bathing area, which by midday would be a cacophony of splashing and chatter, would at this hour be a cavernous, chilled space, the wooden floor still slick from the previous night's cleaning. Her initial task, often shared with a younger apprentice or a male assistant if available, was the arduous process of firing up the kamado, the large brick furnace that heated the bath water. This was no simple matter of flicking a switch. It involved carefully arranging logs and kindling, judging the drafts, and patiently coaxing a flame to life, a process that could take a considerable amount of time, especially in damp conditions. The smoke, thick and acrid, would fill the immediate area around the furnace, a constant companion to the early morning's labor. The efficient heating of water was paramount, not just for the comfort of the patrons, but for the bathhouse's reputation and profitability. Too cold, and customers would grumble. Too hot, and it could be dangerous. The senyo learned to read the temperature of the water by touch, a skill honed through years of experience, long before thermometers were common implements. Once the fire was roaring and the water gradually warming, her attention would shift to the myriad preparatory tasks. The bathing tubs, typically large wooden vats or sometimes stone-lined pools, needed to be thoroughly cleaned. This wasn't merely a rinse. It involved scrubbing away accumulated grime, remnants of human oils, and any stray hairs with brushes and sometimes ash or sand as abrasives. The very air would be thick with the scent of wet wood and a faint, lingering aroma of human cleanliness, a scent that clung to the senyo's clothing and skin throughout her day. Buckets and scoops, towels and washcloths, all needed to be meticulously arranged and ready for the incoming tide of customers. The changing rooms, too, required attention. Tatami mats needed to be dusted and small wooden lockers or shelves wiped down. In an age before widespread plumbing, fresh water had to be hauled, often from a well located on the premises or nearby, for rinsing and general cleaning, a physically demanding chore that added to the senyo's daily burden. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, the sento would begin to stir with life. The senyo's role now shifted from maintenance to management and customer service. She would greet the arriving patrons, collecting their entrance fees, which were typically very modest, reflecting the bathhouse's role as an essential service rather than a luxury. For the poorest citizens, the bathhouse was often the only place where a proper wash was possible, as private bathing facilities were rare outside of wealthy households. The senyo had to be adept at managing the flow of customers, ensuring there wasn't overcrowding in the tubs, and subtly guiding newcomers through the etiquette of the bathhouse. This included reminding them to wash thoroughly before entering the main communal tub, a crucial unwritten rule of Japanese bathing culture that ensured the shared water remained relatively clean. She was, in essence, the silent orchestrator of public hygiene, maintaining order and cleanliness amidst a bustling, often chaotic environment. Her day was a constant cycle of tending to the fire, ensuring the water temperature remained optimal, cleaning up after departing customers, and preparing for new arrivals. The bathhouse was a social hub, a place where news was exchanged, gossip shared, and business deals informally discussed. The senyo, though often overlooked, was privy to much of this information, her ears accustomed to the ebb and flow of conversations. She might hear about a new sumo champion, a pending sumo bout, a merchant's recent success, or the struggles of a local artisan. She was a silent observer of the city's pulse, a repository of its mundane yet vital narratives. Beyond her official duties, She often served as an informal confidant, listening to patrons' woes or offering simple advice. This wasn't part of her job description, but it was an integral part of the human interaction that defined her working life. Her existence was a testament to the relentless, often invisible labor that supported the seemingly effortless flow of Edo society. The steam, the heat, the endless scrubbing, the chatter, the brief moments of quiet respite, all were part of the Senyo's unyielding routine. But what truly distinguished her role, and how did she navigate the complex social dynamics of a space that was both public and intimately personal? The afternoon in an Edo period bathhouse was a stark contrast to the quiet of its early hours. The Senyo's day reached its zenith, a relentless flurry of activity that tested her physical endurance and social acumen. The Sento became a microcosm of Edo society, a place where social strata mingled, albeit with subtle delineations. Samurai, stripped of their swords and finery, mingled with merchants, artisans, and even the occasional wandering priest. The Senyo had to navigate these social currents with a delicate touch. While overt displays of deference were less pronounced within the egalitarian space of the bathhouse, she was acutely aware of the subtle hierarchies that governed Edo life. A gruff tone with a samurai might be overlooked, but outright disrespect could have consequences. Conversely, she had to ensure that the more affluent patrons didn't receive preferential treatment that would alienate the commoners who formed the bulk of her clientele. The sheer volume of customers meant that the Senyo was in constant motion. She collected entrance fees, handed out towels, directed newcomers to the changing rooms, and subtly enforced the bathhouse's rules. One of the most crucial of these was the separation of genders. While some bathhouses had mixed bathing at certain times, most adhered to strict segregation, and it was the Senyo's responsibility to ensure this was maintained. A stray glance or an accidental entry into the wrong section could lead to embarrassment or even a minor scandal. She was, in effect, the guardian of propriety within the steamy confines of the Sento. The physical demands of her job were relentless. The constant bending, lifting, and scrubbing took their toll. The heat and humidity of the bathhouse, while pleasant for the customers, were oppressive for the Senyo. Her clothing, typically a simple cotton kimono, would be perpetually damp, clinging to her skin. The air was thick with the mingled scents of soap, sweat, and the faint, lingering odor of the bathwater, a sensory assault that she had long grown accustomed to, but which undoubtedly contributed to the overall weariness of her day. Amidst the iwi, constant activity, the Senyo also had to deal with the occasional disruptive patron. A drunken customer, a loud argument, or even a minor theft could disrupt the smooth functioning of the bathhouse. She had to be adept at diffusing tense situations, often relying on a combination of firmness and diplomacy. Physical altercations were rare, but the Senyo had to be prepared to intervene if necessary, or at least to summon assistance from other staff, or even nearby residents. The bathhouse was a public space, and with that came the potential for public disturbances. The Senyo's role extended beyond mere cleaning and management. She was also a de facto peacekeeper, ensuring that the Sento remained a place of relaxation and hygiene, rather than a source of conflict. As the afternoon wore on, the pace began to slow. The rush of midday subsided, and the bathhouse took on a more relaxed atmosphere. Regular customers, those who frequented the Sento daily, would often linger, engaging in conversation or simply enjoying the warmth and the company. The Senyo might have a brief respite, a chance to sit down and rest her aching feet, perhaps sharing a quick meal with a fellow worker. These moments of quiet were rare, but they were essential for her to recharge and prepare for the evening's influx of customers. The evening brought a different clientele to the bathhouse. Laborers, artisans, and merchants, their workday done, would flock to the Sento to wash away the grime and fatigue of their labor. The atmosphere became more boisterous, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the splashing of water. The Senyo's energy, however depleted, had to be maintained. She continued her cycle of cleaning, managing, and maintaining order, her movements now almost automatic, her body accustomed to the relentless rhythm of the bathhouse. The Senyo was more than just a cleaner or a manager. She was a vital part of the community. She witnessed the daily lives of countless individuals, their joys, their sorrows, their triumphs, and their struggles. She was a silent observer of the human drama that unfolded within the steamy walls of the Sento. The bathhouse was a place of both physical and social cleansing, and the Senyo was at the heart of it all. But what impact did this constant exposure to the city's undercurrents have on her own life, and how did she find moments of solace amidst the ceaseless demands of her profession? As dusk settled over Edo, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet, the bathhouse hummed with a different energy. The early evening rush of laborers and weary artisans had begun to wane, giving way to a more relaxed, perhaps even intimate atmosphere. This was when some of the more established residents, those with less rigid schedules, might visit, seeking not just cleanliness but also quiet contemplation or a chance to unwind after a day of managing shops or engaging in creative pursuits. For the Senyo, however, there was little change in the relentless pace of her duties. The main bathing tubs, though still warm, required constant attention. The fire in the kamado needed to be stoked and maintained, ensuring the water remained invitingly hot for the last trickle of patrons. The floors, constantly wet from splashes and drips, had to be periodically swept and rinsed to prevent slippery hazards. Even as the number of customers dwindled, the demand for vigilance did not. The evening hours also brought a different kind of social interaction. With fewer people, conversations could become more personal, hushed confidences exchanged, and the underlying currents of Edo society became more apparent. The Senyo, ever present but rarely participating, was a silent witness to these intimate moments. She might overhear tales of unrequited love, the anxieties of a merchant facing financial ruin, or the quiet joy of a family celebrating a small success. These glimpses into the emotional lives of her patrons added another layer to her already complex understanding of the city she served. She saw people at their most vulnerable, stripped not only of their clothes, but often of their daily facades, revealing the raw humanity beneath. This exposure, while perhaps emotionally draining, also granted her a unique perspective, a window into the true pulse of Edo. As the night deepened, eventually the last customers would slowly emerge from the steamy depths of the bathhouse, their skin pink and their spirits softened by the warmth. With their departure, the final most arduous phase of the Senyo's day would begin, the comprehensive closing and cleaning ritual. This was no perfunctory wipe down. The main bathing tubs had to be completely drained, a laborious process involving the removal of large wooden plugs and the careful channeling of vast quantities of water. Once empty, the inside surfaces of the tubs, often made of dark, polished wood, needed to be vigorously scrubbed. This was a deep clean, designed to remove all accumulated residue, ensure sanitation, and prepare the tubs for the next day's use. Brushes, sometimes stiff-bristled, and even a mild abrasive like ash, would be wielded with practiced efficiency. The air, no longer thick with steam, would now carry the faint, clean scent of wet wood and scrubbed surfaces. The draining and cleaning of the large communal tub was a physically demanding task, often requiring considerable strength and stamina. Imagine leaning over the edge, reaching deep into the basin, scrubbing away at the bottom and sides for what could feel like hours. The Senyo's muscles would ache, her hands would be chafed, and her back would protest, but the task had to be completed meticulously. Any laxity could lead to a buildup of grime, impacting the bathhouse's reputation for cleanliness, a crucial aspect in attracting and retaining clientele in a city where hygiene was not always a given. Beyond the tubs, the entire bathing area needed attention. The wooden floors, which had absorbed countless splashes throughout the day, had to be thoroughly scrubbed and rinsed. Drains had to be cleared of hair and debris. Buckets, ladles, and stools were cleaned and neatly stacked. Even the small private washing areas where patrons would pre-wash before entering the main tub required individual attention. Every surface, every implement, was subject to the Senyo's diligent cleaning regimen. Simultaneously, the changing rooms had to be restored to order. Any discarded towels or personal items needed to be collected. The tatami mats, which served as seating and resting areas, had to be dusted and aired. The small wooden lockers and shelves needed to be wiped down, removing any lingering moisture or dust. The very air in these spaces, which had been filled with the chatter and movement of hundreds of people, was now gradually settling into a quiet stillness, punctuated only by the sounds of the Senyo's labor. Finally, the kamado itself, the heart of the bathhouse, needed attention. The fire would be allowed to die down, and the ashes carefully removed and disposed of. The furnace area would be swept clean, ready for the next morning's arduous task of rekindling the flame. This entire closing process could take several hours, pushing the Senyo's workday well past the conventional definition of daylight hours. She might not leave the bathhouse until well after midnight, under the pale glow of the moon, her body heavy with fatigue, but her mind perhaps still replaying the day's endless stream of faces and voices. The Senyo's day, from the crack of dawn to the deep hours of the night, was a testament to the unglamorous but utterly essential labor that underpins any society. She was not a samurai, nor a courtesan, nor a merchant of great renown. She was an ordinary woman, engaged in an extraordinary act of sustained effort and quiet service. Her role in the Edo period bathhouse, while seemingly mundane, was critical for public health, social cohesion, and the very fabric of daily life. The constant provision of clean, warm water was not just a luxury. It was a fundamental necessity in a densely populated city, contributing to the prevention of disease and the overall well-being of its inhabitants. She was a silent guardian of sanitation, a tireless facilitator of a vital community hub. Her story, seemingly boring in its focus on the repetitive and physical, highlights the profound significance of routine, resilience, and the often overlooked contributions of countless individuals throughout history. It reminds us that grand narratives of wars and emperors are only one part of the historical tapestry. The other, equally vital part, is woven from the mundane, from the daily acts of survival and service performed by people like the Senyo. In an age where hot water is readily available at the turn of a tap, and personal hygiene is often a private matter, it is easy to forget the sheer effort and infrastructure that once went into the simple act of bathing. The Edo Senyo stands as a quiet reminder of that effort, a figure whose enduring legacy is perhaps not in grand monuments or famous deeds, but in the unseen threads of cleanliness, community, and the sheer, understated dignity of a day's honest labor. What, then, can we learn from the quiet strength of such forgotten figures, whose daily drudgery sculpted the very bedrock of civilization? Our journey through the mundane yet monumental aspects of history now takes us across continents and centuries, from the steamy communal baths of Edo, Japan, to the opulent, sprawling complexes of ancient Rome. While the Japanese Sento focused on efficient, often humble, hygiene for the masses, the Roman baths, or thermae, were expressions of imperial power, engineering prowess, and a societal obsession with water, cleanliness, and leisure. Yet beneath the grand arches and mosaic floors, the true genius, and indeed the true boring history, lies in the unseen and often uncelebrated systems that made these wonders possible: drainage and sanitation. Without a meticulously planned and rigorously maintained network of pipes, channels, and sewers, these magnificent structures would have been nothing more than stagnant, disease-ridden pits. Imagine Rome in the 2nd century CE, at the zenith of its imperial power. The city was a sprawling metropolis, a testament to human ingenuity and organization. At its heart were the great public baths, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Titus, structures so vast they dwarfed modern. Sports arenas, capable of accommodating thousands of bathers daily. These were not just places to wash. They were social centers, gymnasiums, libraries, lecture halls, and even art galleries. The constant flow of fresh, clean water was paramount to their function, and equally crucial was the efficient removal of wastewater. This was the silent, tireless work of Roman engineers and laborers, a testament to their understanding of hydraulics and public health, far exceeding anything seen for centuries after the empire's fall. The construction of a Roman bath complex began long before the first marble slab was laid, with an elaborate survey of the land and the strategic routing of water. Fresh water, often sourced from distant springs via magnificent aqueducts, was channeled directly into the bathhouses. But what goes in must come out, and this was where the sophisticated drainage systems came into play. Beneath the polished floors, unseen by the thousands of daily visitors, lay a complex web of lead pipes, terracotta conduits, and meticulously constructed stone sewers. These channels were not simply an afterthought. They were integral to the architectural design, woven into the very foundations of the buildings. The Romans understood that for the baths to be hygienic and pleasant, The dirty water from the caldarium, hot room, tepidarium, warm room, and frigidarium, cold room, as well as the waste from the latrines that were invariably part of every major bath complex, needed to be continuously and swiftly removed. The design of these drainage systems was surprisingly advanced. Roman engineers utilized the natural topography of the land whenever possible, creating gently sloping channels that allowed gravity to do much of the work. Where natural slopes were insufficient, they engineered intricate systems of gradients, sometimes employing inverted siphons to move water across uneven terrain, a testament to their grasp of fluid dynamics. Lead pipes, though expensive and labor-intensive to produce, were favored for their durability and malleability, allowing for complex routing and tight seals, minimizing leaks. Terracotta pipes, though more brittle, were cheaper and often used for less pressurized or more accessible sections of the network. The sheer scale of these piping systems was immense, requiring vast quantities of materials and a skilled workforce to lay and join them effectively. Imagine the legions of laborers toiling underground, shaping stone and fusing lead, all to ensure the seamless flow of water that would enable the Romans' daily ritual of bathing. Furthermore, the Romans pioneered the use of subfloor heating, systems known as hypocausts, which relied on the circulation of hot air and smoke from furnaces beneath the raised floors. This innovative heating method generated considerable soot and ash, which also needed to be managed and removed. The hypocaust system itself often integrated channels for air circulation that doubled as conduits for some waste gases. This intricate interplay between heating and drainage highlights a holistic approach to environmental control within the bathhouses. The wastewater from the bathing pools, often warmed and laden with oils, soaps, or rather the olive oil and strigils used for cleaning, and human effluvia, was not simply discharged willy-nilly. It was carefully collected and channeled into larger main sewers, which then emptied into the city's vast network, culminating in the monumental Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer of Rome itself. This ancient marvel, parts of which are still in use today, was a testament to Roman foresight in urban planning and sanitation. Without these subterranean lifelines, the grandeur of the Roman baths would have been utterly unsustainable, transforming from hygienic havens into festering cesspools. But how exactly did these seemingly mundane systems prevent disease and maintain such a high standard of public health in an age without germ theory? The seemingly simple act of bathing in a Roman therme was, in reality, a meticulously engineered dance of water management. To understand how these drainage systems prevented disease, even without a scientific understanding of pathogens, we must look at the principles they implicitly followed: constant flow, efficient waste removal, and segregation of clean and wastewater. The Romans intuitively understood that stagnant water was problematic, and that the removal of human waste was crucial for a healthy urban environment. Their solution was not sophisticated filtration or chemical treatment, but rather sheer volume and continuous movement. Fresh water from the aqueducts continuously replenished the bathing pools. The frigidarium, with its cold plunge pools, often had the cleanest water, as it was closest to the aqueduct's intake and typically saw the least contamination from human oils and dirt. The water would then often flow into the tepidarium, warm room, and finally into the caldarium, hot room. This cascade system, while not universal, meant that the hottest and most used pools received water that had already circulated through other sections, but more importantly, it ensured a constant inflow and outflow. As new fresh water entered, the older, dirtier water was continually displaced and directed into the drainage channels. This principle of continuous flushing was paramount. Rather than recycling or treating the water, the Romans simply used so much of it that contamination was diluted and then swiftly carried away. It was a brute force method, perhaps, but remarkably effective for its time. Beneath the very feet of the bathers, strategically placed drainage openings allowed the constant overflow of water from the pools to escape into the subfloor channels. These channels, typically constructed of durable stone or concrete and sometimes lined with lead, ran beneath the entire bath complex, converging into larger conduits. The floors themselves were often slightly sloped towards these drains, ensuring that spilled water or water from washing areas quickly moved away. This constant removal of standing water was crucial in preventing the growth of algae, the accumulation of filth, and the attraction of insects, all of which could contribute to unsanitary conditions. Even the sweat and grime scraped from the bathers' bodies with a strigil, a curved metal tool, would be washed down these well-designed slopes. Beyond the bathing pools, the latrines, public toilets, within the bath complexes represented another significant challenge that the Romans tackled with remarkable foresight. These were typically communal, long benches with holes cut into them, beneath which ran a continuous stream of fresh water. This flowing water served as a primitive but effective flushing system, carrying away human waste into the main sewer network. The water for the latrines often came from the overflow of the bathing pools, demonstrating another clever reuse of water before its final discharge. This innovative approach to public sanitation was a major contributor to urban hygiene in Rome, far surpassing the waste disposal methods of many later European cities for centuries. The design often included small channels in front of the seating for washing sponges, further illustrating their commitment to personal cleanliness within a shared space. The main sewers of Rome, culminating in engineering marvels like the cloaca, maxima, were the ultimate recipients of all this wastewater. These massive underground tunnels, some large enough for a cart to pass through, were built with durable materials and often had a gentle incline to facilitate flow. They were a testament to long-term planning, designed to serve the city for centuries. The construction and maintenance of these sewers required immense logistical effort. Squads of laborers, known as cloacarii, were tasked with periodically inspecting and clearing blockages, a truly unenviable and hazardous job. They would wade through the fetid waters, dislodging debris, accumulated silt, and other detritus, ensuring the continuous flow. This ongoing maintenance was just as critical as the initial construction in preserving the functionality of the system, and by extension, the health of the city. Without these unsung heroes, the sophisticated engineering would have quickly failed, turning Rome into a far less habitable place. The sheer volume of water channeled through the Roman baths and into the city's sewers also played a role in flushing the urban environment. The discharged water from the baths, even though it was waste, was still relatively clean compared to other forms of urban effluent. When it entered the main sewer system, it helped to dilute and carry away other forms of waste, contributing to a broader level of public hygiene. This was a form of environmental engineering by proxy, leveraging the infrastructure of the baths for wider urban sanitation. The impact on public health, though not understood in terms of germ theory, was profound. By continuously removing human waste and preventing the accumulation of stagnant water, the Romans significantly reduced the breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and the spread of waterborne illnesses that plagued many other ancient and medieval cities. While they might not have known about bacteria, they recognized the link between foul odors, dirty water, and illness, and their engineering solutions directly addressed these observable problems. The Roman baths were thus not just architectural marvels, but vital components of a sophisticated urban health strategy, a testament to their practical genius. But what happened when these intricate systems inevitably failed, or when Rome itself began its slow decline, and what became of this remarkable hydraulic knowledge? Even the most robust and ingenious systems are susceptible to the inexorable march of time, neglect, and the shifting fortunes of empires. The magnificent drainage networks that underpinned Rome's vast public baths, a testament to unparalleled engineering, eventually succumbed to these forces. As Rome entered its long period of decline, particularly from the 3rd century CE onwards, the meticulous maintenance that was so crucial to the functionality of the baths and their associated sanitation systems began to falter. The constant clearing of silt, the repair of cracked pipes, and the reconstruction of collapsed sections required significant resources, both financial and human, which became increasingly scarce. The initial challenges were often pragmatic. Earthquakes, though infrequent, could cause widespread damage to aqueducts and sewer lines, disrupting the flow of water and waste. Flooding from the Tiber River, a perennial problem for Rome, could overwhelm the drainage systems, backing up sewage and spreading disease. But more insidious than natural disasters was the slow erosion of institutional will and economic capacity. The public works, once a source of immense pride and political leverage for emperors and senators, became a burden. Funds were diverted to military campaigns, imperial excesses, or simply became unobtainable due to economic instability. The specialized knowledge and labor required for maintaining such complex hydraulic systems began to dwindle. The cloacarii, The unheralded sanitation workers likely found their ranks thinned, their equipment decaying, and their incentives reduced. As maintenance faltered, the consequences were inevitable. Drains would become partially blocked, leading to slower flow and the accumulation of waste. Overflows would become more frequent, contributing to stagnant puddles and unsanitary conditions within and around the baths. Without regular cleaning, the buildup of organic matter and mineral deposits within the pipes would constrict their capacity, further exacerbating the problems. The sheer volume of fresh water needed to continuously flush the systems became harder to deliver as aqueducts fell into disrepair or were deliberately cut by invaders during sieges. Without the constant influx of clean water, the principle of continuous flushing, the very bedrock of Roman bath hygiene, was undermined. Stagnation replaced flow, and the magnificent baths, once beacons of cleanliness, began their slow transformation into malodorous, less inviting places. By the 5th and 6th centuries CE, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, many of the great thermae were either abandoned, converted to other uses, or significantly reduced in scale and grandeur. The massive infrastructure that supported them, the aqueducts, the feeder pipes, and most critically the drainage networks, were largely left to decay. Barbarian invaders often targeted aqueducts as a strategic means of weakening the city, and once cut, the complex process of repairing them was often beyond the capacity of the fragmented post-imperial authorities. The sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, fluid dynamics, and large-scale public sanitation that the Romans had pioneered was largely lost or became localized knowledge, scattered among isolated monastic communities or feudal lords with limited resources. The long-term impact of this decline was profound. For centuries after the fall of Rome, public hygiene in Europe regressed significantly. The concept of widespread public bathing as a daily ritual largely disappeared, replaced by more individual and often less frequent washing habits. The understanding of systematic waste removal and large-scale urban sanitation effectively vanished. European cities in the Middle Ages and early modern period often struggled with widespread disease, and the lack of proper drainage and sewage systems played a significant role. Open sewers, waste thrown into streets, and contaminated water sources became the norm, contributing to epidemics that decimated populations. It was not until the 19th century, with the advent of industrialization, growing urban populations, and a renewed understanding of public health, driven by figures like Edwin Chadwick and the realization of germ theory, that Europe began to rebuild sophisticated urban sanitation systems on a scale comparable to, or even surpassing, that of ancient Rome. The story of Roman bath drainage, though undeniably boring in its focus on pipes and flow rates, is a powerful reminder of the intricate relationship between engineering, public health, and societal prosperity. It demonstrates that the unseen infrastructure, the systems that silently manage the mundane necessities of life, are as vital to the flourishing of a civilization as its grandest monuments or its most celebrated leaders. The Roman emphasis on continuous flow and robust waste removal, while not rooted in modern microbiology, was an intuitive and remarkably effective strategy for mitigating disease in densely populated urban environments. Their ability to manage water on such a vast scale, both for supply and disposal, remains a testament to their practical genius. The lessons learned from the rise and fall of these systems underscore that neglect of basic infrastructure can have far-reaching and devastating consequences, affecting the very quality of life and health of an entire populace. It prompts us to consider how much of our modern comfort and public health do we owe to the uncelebrated principles of effective drainage, and what unseen mundane systems are we perhaps neglecting today, the consequences of which might only become apparent to future generations? Having explored the engineered marvels of Roman bath drainage and the tireless routines of Edo period bathhouse attendants, we now turn our gaze to a period often characterized by its perceived lack of cleanliness: medieval Europe. The popular image of the Middle Ages is one of squalor, disease, and a general disregard for personal hygiene. While it's true that the sophisticated, large-scale public sanitation systems of Rome largely vanished, and the communal bathing practices differed significantly from those in Japan, it would be an oversimplification to declare the entire era uniformly dirty. Instead, the story of hygiene in medieval Europe is one of fragmented practices, localized solutions, and a persistent, albeit humble, struggle against the ever-present challenges of waste and disease. It is a narrative woven from individual habits, monastic routines, burgeoning urban regulations, and the constant, often unremarked effort to maintain some semblance of order in a world without modern conveniences. Consider the stark contrast. To Rome, the grand aqueducts lay in ruins, public bathhouses crumbled or were repurposed, and the scientific understanding of disease was rudimentary at best, often attributed to divine wrath or miasma, bad air. Yet people still needed to wash, to dispose of waste, and to prevent the spread of illness as best they could. The focus shifted from vast public infrastructure to more decentralized, often private or community-driven efforts. For the majority of the population, living in rural agricultural settings, personal hygiene was largely a matter of proximity to natural water sources and the demands of their daily labor. Rivers, streams, and wells served as primary sources for drinking, cooking, and washing. A quick dip in a river on a warm day, or a basin wash with water hauled from a well, constituted the typical bathing routine. The emphasis was often on practicality and necessity, rather than leisure or elaborate rituals. Clothes were washed, though perhaps not as frequently as in modern times, in communal washing spots along rivers, with rudimentary soaps made from animal fats and lye. In the nascent towns and burgeoning cities, however, the challenge of hygiene became far more acute. Densely packed populations, narrow streets, and the close proximity of human and animal life created an environment ripe for the spread of disease. Unlike the meticulously planned Roman cities with their extensive sewer systems, medieval towns often grew organically, with little forethought given to waste management. Waste, both human and animal, was frequently thrown into the streets where it would accumulate until heavy rains might wash it away, or local pigs might scavenge it. This practice, while appearing utterly disgusting to modern sensibilities, was a desperate, if ineffective, attempt at disposal in the absence of organized infrastructure. The air would have been thick with the mingled odors of refuse, smoke, from countless hearths, and the pervasive scent of unwashed bodies. This sensory landscape was an inescapable part of daily life, something that generations simply learned to tolerate. Yet, even within this challenging environment, a rudimentary form of urban sanitation began to emerge, driven by necessity and the practical realities of governing a growing populace. Local authorities, whether monastic orders, feudal lords, or nascent municipal councils, slowly began to implement regulations. These were often reactive, prompted by outbreaks of disease or unbearable stench. Early ordinances might prohibit the dumping of refuse directly outside one's door, or mandate its removal to specific dumping grounds outside the city walls. While these laws were often difficult to enforce and frequently ignored, they represent the humble beginnings of public hygiene consciousness. The concept of nuisance became a legal framework for addressing unsanitary conditions, focusing on issues like overflowing privies, fouled water sources, and the accumulation of waste that directly impacted public health and comfort. The monastic communities, islands of relative order and learning in a sometimes chaotic world, often maintained a higher standard of hygiene than the surrounding populace. Monasteries frequently had sophisticated water systems, not on the scale of Roman aqueducts, but ingenious for their time, channeling water from nearby springs or rivers for drinking, cooking, and sanitation. They often included dedicated washing, rooms, lavatoria, and even latrines flushed by diverted streams. These practices were rooted in monastic rules that emphasized cleanliness of body and spirit. Their enclosed nature and disciplined routines allowed for a level of hygiene that was difficult to replicate in the sprawling, less controlled urban environments. However, these localized pockets of cleanliness did not translate into widespread societal improvements. The challenges of scale, resources, and public education remained immense. The struggle for cleanliness in medieval towns was less about grand engineering and more about daily, arduous, and often thankless tasks, relying on the individual actions of citizens and the nascent, often ineffective, efforts of local authorities. But what specific everyday methods did people employ to keep themselves and their surroundings clean? And how did these evolve over the centuries? To truly grasp the reality of hygiene in medieval Europe, we must look beyond the grand narratives of kings and castles and delve into the daily routines of ordinary individuals, often in stark contrast to their Roman predecessors or Edo counterparts. Without widespread public baths or sophisticated plumbing, cleanliness became a more personal, resourceful, and often localized endeavor. The methods employed were often simple, practical, and heavily reliant on readily available resources, demonstrating a tenacious adaptation to environmental constraints rather than a disregard for cleanliness itself. For personal hygiene, water was the primary agent, and its availability dictated much. While daily full-body immersion was rare for many, washing hands and face was a far more common practice, particularly before meals or after working with animals or in fields. Basins of water, drawn from wells, rivers, or collected rainwater, would be used for this purpose. The concept of dry cleaning was also prevalent, especially for those who could afford it. This involved brushing off dirt and dust from clothes and skin, and using cloths to wipe oneself. Rubbing with rough linen or wool could remove a surprising amount of grime, and while not as effective as water, it was a practical alternative in an era where hauling and heating large quantities of water was a laborious chore. For wealthier individuals, finely woven cloths and even perfumes or herbal rinses might be employed, masking odors rather than eliminating them, a common practice across many pre-modern societies. Soap, though not mass-produced as it is today, was known and used. Early medieval soaps were often harsh, made from animal fats, tallow, and wood ash lye, resulting in a product more akin to modern-day laundry soap than a gentle bar for the skin. Despite its abrasiveness, it served its purpose, particularly for washing clothes and linens. For personal washing, gentler alternatives existed. Various herbs were used for their aromatic and cleansing properties. Sage, rosemary, lavender, and mint were common additions to bathing water or simply rubbed onto the skin. These botanical remedies offered a fragrant, if not thoroughly sanitizing effect. Moreover, sweating was often considered a form of cleansing, prompting the use of small private steam baths or sweat lodges in some regions, particularly in Northern and Eastern Europe, echoing the Roman laconicum or sudatorium in a more rustic form. These were less about immersion and more about purification through perspiration. Hair care, particularly in an age when head lice were a constant concern, was also a significant part of personal hygiene. Combing, sometimes with fine-toothed combs, was a daily ritual to remove nits and debris. Herbal rinses were again popular, used to condition hair and deter parasites. For those with long hair, braiding or tying it up helped manage tangles and reduce exposure to dirt and pests. Beards and facial hair, common among men, also required care, often being combed and trimmed regularly. Dental hygiene was rudimentary, but present. People chewed on twigs, used rough cloths to wipe their teeth, or rinsed their mouths with water or herbal infusions to freshen breath. The diet, often coarser and less sugary than modern diets, might have paradoxically contributed to fewer cavities for some, though gum disease and tooth loss were undoubtedly common. Within the household, cleanliness was a constant battle against dust, dirt, and pests. Floors, often made of packed earth, stone, or rough timber, were swept regularly, sometimes with brooms made of bundled twigs. Rushes, strewn across floors, served as a primitive form of carpeting, trapping dirt and absorbing spills. These rushes were periodically replaced, taking much of the accumulated filth with them. Hearths were regularly cleared of ash, and cooking utensils, typically made of iron or pottery, were scrubbed with sand, ash, and water. Beds, often simple straw mattresses, were aired out, and the straw stuffing replaced when it became soiled or infested. The fight against fleas, lice, and rats was relentless, employing everything from herbal repellents, like tansy or wormwood scattered in bedding, to domestic animals like cats, which served a vital role in pest control. The disposal of waste remained the greatest challenge, especially in towns. While some ordinances slowly emerged, the primary method of sewage disposal for most urban dwellers was the privy or latrine. These were often simple pits dug into the ground, either freestanding or attached to a house. For multi-story buildings, garderobes, essentially chutes, emptied directly into a pit below, or sometimes infamously, directly into the street or a moat. The contents of these pits would periodically be emptied by night soilmen, or gong, farmers, who would carry the waste away to be used as fertilizer in fields outside the city walls. This was a foul, dangerous, but essential profession, highlighting the pragmatic, albeit unpleasant, solutions devised for sanitation. The sheer scale of waste generated by even a small town necessitated these unsung laborers. Water from household use, often containing food scraps and other organic matter, was generally simply thrown into the streets or gutters, where it would eventually find its way to a river or stream, contributing to the pollution of vital water. Sources. The persistent effort to maintain cleanliness in medieval Europe, despite the lack of advanced technology, speaks to an inherent human desire for order and health. It was a cleanliness born of necessity, of practical adaptation, and of a nascent understanding that filth contributed to discomfort and illness. Yet, these fragmented practices and localized efforts were constantly battling against overwhelming odds. The burgeoning populations, the lack of central authority, and the limited scientific knowledge meant that progress was painfully slow. The shadow of disease, particularly the devastating plagues, always loomed. But how did these seemingly inadequate measures shape the survival of medieval communities? And what unforeseen consequences arose from their daily struggle for hygiene? The daily struggle for cleanliness in medieval Europe, characterized by its localized and often reactive nature, had profound, albeit often unquantified, impacts on the survival and evolution of communities. While the era is frequently painted with broad strokes of unhygienic practices, the persistent, mundane efforts of individuals and nascent civic bodies were, in their own way, crucial survival strategies against a relentless backdrop of disease and discomfort. These seemingly inadequate measures didn't prevent all epidemics, but they undoubtedly mitigated their severity and frequency, shaping the trajectory of urban development and the resilience of human populations. One significant, yet largely unheralded consequence of these humble hygiene practices was the limitation of localized outbreaks. While major pandemics like the Black Death swept across continents, the everyday acts of sweeping floors, disposing of household waste, even if imperfectly, and occasional washing meant that many common illnesses did not become universally endemic. The very fact that people were not constantly dying from basic infections speaks to a baseline level of practical hygiene being maintained, however rudimentary. The communal water sources, though vulnerable to pollution, also served as vital points of social interaction and shared responsibility. A well that became noticeably foul would prompt collective action, even if that action was limited to simply finding another water source or complaining to a local lord. This forced community engagement around vital resources fostered a rudimentary understanding of cause and effect, even without a germ theory. Furthermore, the very act of cleaning, even if not perfectly effective, provided a sense of control and order in a world often defined by chaos. The regularity of household chores, the sweeping of rushes, the washing of clothes in the river, these were not just about removing dirt. They were rituals that imposed structure on daily life. This psychological benefit, though intangible, contributed to the mental well-being of a populace facing constant hardship. The visual and olfactory improvements, even slight, made living conditions more tolerable, contributing to a sense of habitability that encouraged settlement and growth in urban centers. Without some level of baseline cleanliness, the burgeoning towns would have become uninhabitable much more quickly, stifling the very economic and social developments that characterized the later Middle Ages. However, these piecemeal approaches also led to unforeseen consequences and revealed the limitations of relying solely on individual or small-scale efforts. The practice of throwing waste into streets, though a desperate measure of disposal, created breeding grounds for rodents and insects, which in turn acted as vectors for diseases like the bubonic plague. The use of shared water sources, while convenient, meant that contamination in one part of a river or well could quickly spread illness throughout an entire community. The night soil men, while essential, themselves moved through highly contaminated environments, potentially spreading pathogens even as they removed waste. The very density of medieval towns, which facilitated trade and cultural exchange, simultaneously amplified the challenges of waste management and disease transmission. The lack of standardized enforced regulations meant that progress in public hygiene was often sporadic and dependent on the conscientiousness of individual householders or the whim of local authorities. The persistent odor and visible filth of medieval streets also had a social dimension. They were simply part of the accepted sensory landscape, and perhaps even fostered a certain immunity to disgust that would be unthinkable today. This tolerance for unsanitary conditions, while a pragmatic adaptation, also meant that the impetus for radical change was often slow to materialize until a truly catastrophic event, like a widespread plague, forced the issue. It was through these devastating experiences, coupled with the slow accumulation of practical knowledge and the eventual reemergence of centralized authority, that more structured approaches to urban planning and public health would eventually begin to take shape in the late medieval and early modern periods. The medieval story of hygiene, then, is not one of abject failure, but rather of resilience through rudimentary means. It demonstrates humanity's continuous, often overlooked struggle to maintain a semblance of order and health in challenging circumstances. It underscores the profound impact of daily routines and the collective accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant acts of cleanliness. The foundations laid by these humble beginnings, the first street sweeping ordinances, the management of privies, the community efforts around water sources, eventually paved the way for the great public health reforms of later centuries. They remind us that progress is not always linear or dramatic, but often built upon generations of quiet, persistent effort in the face of daunting challenges. In a modern world saturated with sanitizers and instant access to clean water, it is easy to forget the profound value of these basic necessities and the sheer human ingenuity required to secure them in a less technologically advanced age. What subtle forms of mundane hygiene are we neglecting today, the absence of which might reveal itself only to future generations as a fundamental oversight? From the unseen sanitation of ancient Rome and the humble hygiene of medieval Europe, we now transport ourselves to the glittering, often perplexing world of 18th century Georgian England. This was an era defined by burgeoning scientific inquiry, grand architectural statements, and a peculiar, pervasive fashion accessory that epitomized social status and cultural norms: the periwig, or simply, the wig. Far from being a mere aesthetic choice, the daily ritual of wearing, maintaining, and powdering a wig for a Georgian gentleman was a meticulous, time-consuming, and surprisingly mundane affair, reflecting not just vanity, but deep-seated societal expectations, practical considerations, and an entire industry built upon artificial hair and flower. Imagine, if you will, a gentleman in his London townhouse on a typical morning in, say, 1770. The sun is barely filtering through the grime of the city, but within his bedchamber, a delicate dance of preparation is already underway. Unlike the modern man's relatively simple routine of a quick shower and a comb through natural hair, the Georgian gentleman's first thought, upon waking, was often not for his own scalp, but for the inanimate, yet utterly vital adornment that would complete his public persona, his wig. This wasn't a cheap, disposable item. A well-made wig, crafted from human hair, horsehair, or goat hair, could cost a considerable sum, equivalent to a significant portion of a servant's annual wage, or even a small house. It was an investment, a symbol of wealth, status, and adherence to the prevailing fashion. Before he could even contemplate putting it on, the wig itself had to be prepared. This usually fell to a specialized servant, a valet, or a perruquier's apprentice, if the gentleman was wealthy enough to afford one. The wig from the previous day, likely misshapen from wear, sweat, and perhaps a night on a wig stand, needed meticulous attention. It would first be carefully brushed and combed to remove tangles and any accumulated dust or debris. This was a delicate operation, as the curls and intricate styles of the era could easily be damaged. For a truly elaborate wig, this might involve specialized combs and brushes designed to navigate its many layers and intricacies. Then came the powdering. This was the most iconic and perhaps messiest part of the ritual. Wig powder was typically made from finely ground starch, often wheat flour, sometimes mixed with plaster of Paris, and usually scented with orange flower, lavender, or orris root to mask less pleasant odors. The gentleman himself would often don a powdering gown or a simple sheet to protect his expensive clothes from the fine white dust. The wig would be placed on a wig stand, and the powder, held in a bellows-like dispenser or a simple bag, would be puffed and dusted generously over its surface. The goal was to achieve a uniform, opaque white or off-white coating, signifying cleanliness and fashion adherence. This process was far from clean. Powder would drift through the air, settling on furniture, clothes, and the unfortunate servant administering it. The air in the room, particularly in the morning, would often have a fine, starchy haze. Beyond the aesthetics, the powder served a practical purpose. It helped absorb grease and dirt from the wearer's scalp, extended the time between washings of the wig, a complex and damaging process. and even acted as a rudimentary insecticide, deterring lice. However, it was also highly flammable, a dangerous characteristic in an age of open flames and candlelight. The valet would then carefully pat down the powder, ensuring it adhered evenly and wasn't too thick in any one spot. Any excess would be carefully brushed away, but the residue would inevitably remain, a constant companion of the Georgian gentleman. Finally, the wig was ready to be placed upon the gentleman's head. This required skill as the wig needed to sit, securely and comfortably. It would be secured with ribbons or pins to the gentleman's tightly cropped natural hair, or a special cap worn underneath. The fit had to be just right. Too loose and it could shift awkwardly. Too tight and it would be uncomfortable. The process from initial brushing to final placement could easily consume an hour, sometimes more for particularly elaborate styles or if the gentleman was fastidious. This was not a quick departure from the home. It was a carefully choreographed opening to the day, ensuring the gentleman was impeccably presented to the world. But what were the underlying motivations for this seemingly impractical fashion? And how did its pervasive presence shape the very fabric of Georgian society, beyond mere appearances? The pervasiveness of the powdered wig in Georgian society, and indeed across much of 18th century Europe, was far more than a fleeting trend or simple vanity. It was a complex phenomenon rooted in a confluence of social status, political symbolism, practical considerations, and even the lingering aftermath of earlier health crises. Understanding the daily ritual of the wig requires delving into these deeper motivations, revealing how this seemingly absurd fashion became a profound statement about one's place in the world. At its core, the wig was an undeniable status symbol. Its cost, the labor required to maintain it, and the sheer impracticality of wearing a large powdered contraption on one's head all contributed to its exclusivity. Only those with sufficient wealth and leisure could afford to wear and upkeep such an elaborate accessory. A gentleman arriving in society with a perfectly styled, freshly powdered wig immediately conveyed his position, his affluence, and his adherence to the elite norms of the day. The larger and more intricately curled the wig, the more pronounced the statement of wealth and consequence. This visual cue was instantly recognizable across all social strata, serving as a silent yet powerful declaration of one's standing. For those aspiring to rise in society, adopting the wig was a crucial step, even if it meant significant financial strain. It was a tangible investment in one's social capital, a nonverbal agreement to the rules of the game. The origins of the wig, tracing back to the 17th century French court of Louis XIV, also imbued it with political and social cachet. Louis XIV popularized wigs to disguise his premature baldness, and as France was the arbiter of European fashion and diplomacy, the trend quickly spread. By the Georgian era, the wig had become synonymous with respectability, authority, and the established order. Judges wore wigs, lawyers wore wigs, and members of parliament wore wigs. To be seen without one, particularly in formal settings, could imply a lack of seriousness, decorum, or even a subversive political leaning. The wig, therefore, was not merely a fashion accessory, but a uniform of the ruling and professional classes, cementing their position and presenting a united, if artfully constructed, front to the world. Beyond these grander considerations, there were also surprisingly practical reasons for the wig's enduring popularity. One significant factor was hygiene, or rather, the challenges to hygiene in the pre-modern era. Lice were a pervasive problem across all social classes, and natural hair, particularly long hair, provided an ideal habitat for these parasites. Shaving or tightly cropping one's own hair and wearing a wig allowed for easier management of infestations. The wig itself could be removed, cleaned, and treated separately. The aforementioned powder, while messy, also acted as a rudimentary insecticide, and its fine, starchy consistency could absorb oils and dirt, helping to keep the underlying scalp somewhat cleaner. Furthermore, wigs often masked poor personal hygiene, providing a convenient cover for unwashed hair and body odor. In an era where daily bathing was not common, the wig served as a crucial element of presenting a clean and respectable facade. The wig industry itself was a massive, intricate network of skilled artisans and laborers. Perruquiers, or wig makers, were highly specialized craftsmen who painstakingly constructed these elaborate pieces. The process involved sourcing hair, often from human donors, the poor who sold their hair for income, but also from horses or goats. and then carefully weaving or knotting it onto a foundation made of net or wire. The styling was an art form, involving curling irons heated over charcoal, pomades made from animal fats, and endless hours of intricate work to achieve the desired voluminous, architectural shapes. There were numerous styles. The formal full-bottomed wig, a legacy from the 17th century, the more practical bag wig, where the queue or tail of the wig was enclosed in a silk bag, the military-inspired pigtail or queue wig, and the simpler, less formal bob wig. Each style carried its own connotations and was appropriate for different occasions. Maintaining a wardrobe of wigs was a constant undertaking. A gentleman would possess several wigs for different purposes: everyday wear, formal occasions, travel. These wigs required regular cleaning, recurling, and repowdering. The washing process was complex, involving careful soaking, gentle scrubbing, and then slow drying on specialized stands, often near a fire, which carried its own risks. The perruquier's shop would have dedicated rooms filled with wig stands, hot irons, and the pervasive scent of hair and powder. The daily ritual of powdering at home was just one aspect of a continuous cycle of maintenance that ensured the wig remained a pristine symbol of status. The economic impact was significant, creating jobs for perruquiers, barbers, wig makers' apprentices, and even those who harvested the raw materials for powder and pomades. Thus, the Georgian gentleman's wig was far more than a fashion statement. It was a societal cornerstone, a silent language of status, authority, and a pragmatic response to the hygienic challenges of the age. Its daily donning and elaborate maintenance underscore a fascinating intersection of vanity, practicality, and the subtle, often unwritten rules that governed social interaction. But how did this elaborate and environmentally impactful fashion eventually fall from grace? And what did its decline signify about the changing values of a new era? The powdered wig, for all its pervasive influence and symbolic weight throughout, much of the 18th century was not immune to the capricious currents of fashion, societal shifts, and even revolutionary fervor. Its decline, though gradual, was a telling indicator of profound changes sweeping across Europe, marking a subtle yet significant shift from the rigid formalities of the Georgian era to the more naturalistic ideals that would define the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The story of its fall from grace is as boring in its slow unfolding as its daily maintenance, yet deeply significant in what it reveals about evolving tastes and values. One of the primary drivers of the wig's decline was simply the expense and impracticality of its daily upkeep. The constant need for powder, the specialized care by perruquier, and the sheer time involved in donning and maintaining the elaborate styles became increasingly burdensome. As the century progressed, an emerging middle class, while aspirational, found the financial and logistical demands of the wig unsustainable for everyday wear. They sought a more understated elegance, a form of dress that was perhaps less ostentatious, but still conveyed respectability. This economic reality began to chip away at the wig's universal appeal, pushing it from an everyday necessity to a more formal, occasional accessory. Beyond economic considerations, changing aesthetic sensibilities played a crucial role. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, nature, and individual liberty, began to influence fashion. There was a growing preference for more natural hair, simpler styles, and less artificial adornment. The ideals of classical antiquity, often depicted with flowing, unpowdered hair, also gained traction. The stiff, architectural forms of the powdered wig, once symbols of refined taste, began to appear increasingly artificial and even ludicrous to a generation that valued simplicity and a return to nature. This shift wasn't sudden. It was a slow, almost imperceptible drift in the collective consciousness, where what was once considered peak elegance gradually became outdated and cumbersome. However, the most significant catalyst for the wig's rapid decline was undoubtedly the French Revolution, which began in 1789. The wig, inextricably linked to the French aristocracy and the Ancien Regime, became a powerful symbol of privilege, oppression, and everything the revolutionaries sought to overthrow. To wear a powdered wig in Revolutionary France was to invite suspicion, ridicule, or even worse. The move towards simpler, unpowdered hair, often cropped short in the tightest cut, inspired by Roman busts and a rejection of aristocratic excess, became an act of political solidarity and a visual declaration of Republican ideals. This revolutionary zeal quickly crossed the English Channel and influenced British fashion. While Britain did not undergo its own revolution, the ideas of liberty and a more egalitarian society resonated, and the trappings of the old order, including the elaborate wig, began to feel anachronistic and unpatriotic. The final nail in the wig's coffin came not from political ideology, but from taxation and military decree. In 1795, the British government, desperate to fund the Napoleonic Wars, introduced a tax on hair powder. While seemingly minor, this tax made the already expensive daily ritual of wig wearing even more prohibitive for many, providing a strong economic disincentive. Furthermore, military reforms, particularly under figures like the Duke of York, encouraged simpler, more practical hairstyles for soldiers, moving away from the cumbersome powdered queue. As military style often influenced civilian fashion, this contributed to the wig's decline among younger, more progressive gentlemen. The cumulative effect of these factors, economic burden, changing aesthetics, political symbolism, and practical disincentives, led to the wig's gradual but ultimately complete disappearance from common civilian wear by the early 19th century. What replaced the powdered wig was a return to natural hair, often cut shorter and styled with a simpler, less ornate approach. The new ideal was a more understated, masculine elegance, emphasizing neatness and cleanliness of one's own hair rather than relying on an artificial construction. This shift marked a broader change in the very definition of gentlemanly appearance, moving away from overt displays of wealth and towards a more subtle, self-controlled presentation. The perruquier, once a highly sought-after craftsman, saw his trade diminish, replaced by the barber who focused on cutting and styling natural hair. The industry that had supported the wig, from hair suppliers to powder manufacturers, had to adapt or perish. The curious case of the Georgian gentleman's wig, seemingly a trivial detail of fashion history, offers a fascinating lens through which to view profound societal shifts. It underscores how deeply intertwined fashion can be with economic realities, political ideologies, and evolving cultural values. The wig's rise and fall illustrate that even the most deeply entrenched social norms and sartorial practices are ultimately subject to change, often driven by a multitude of boring underlying factors rather than singular dramatic events. It reminds us that what appears outlandish or impractical to one generation was utterly indispensable to another, reflecting their unique challenges and aspirations. What daily rituals do we engage in today, seemingly innocuous or essential, that future generations might look back upon with similar bemusement, wondering at their origins and eventual obsolescence? Having explored the meticulous rituals of personal grooming in Georgian England, we now turn our attention to an even more fundamental, yet equally mundane aspect of daily life that subtly shaped the modern world: the measurement of time. Specifically, we will delve into the unassuming, often overlooked genesis of Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. Today, GMT is a foundational concept, the historical bedrock upon which our interconnected global society operates, dictating everything from air travel, schedules to financial transactions. Yet, its early days were not marked by dramatic breakthroughs, but by decades of painstaking scientific observation, mechanical ingenuity, and the persistent, meticulous labor of astronomers and horologists. It was a victory of precision over chaos, a quiet revolution that underpinned the age of exploration and global commerce. Imagine the world before standardized time. Each town, each city, operated on its own local time, determined by the sun's highest point at noon. While this might seem quaint, it presented an increasingly intractable problem as trade expanded. Travel became more frequent, and most critically, as the great seafaring nations embarked on voyages of global discovery. The ability to accurately determine longitude at sea was a life or death matter. Without knowing one's precise east-west position, ships could easily be lost, run aground, or miss their destinations entirely. This was a particularly vexing problem for the British Empire, whose global ambitions depended on safe and efficient maritime navigation. The key to solving this navigational dilemma lay not in stars or compasses alone, but in an accurate, reliable, and standardized measurement of time. The concept of a single, universal time reference began to coalesce in the 17th century, driven largely by the practical demands of navigation and astronomy. For centuries, longitude had been a navigator's bane. While latitude could be determined relatively easily by observing the sun's height at noon or the stars at night, longitude required knowing the exact time at a reference point, like a home port, simultaneously with the local time at the ship's current position. Every hour of difference corresponded to 15 degrees of longitude. A small error in timekeeping translated into hundreds of miles of navigational error, with potentially catastrophic consequences for ships and their valuable cargo. The problem was so pressing that in 1714, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, offering a substantial prize, $20,000, an astronomical sum for the era, to anyone who could devise a practical method for determining longitude at sea to within half a degree of accuracy. This act, while spurring innovation, underscored the immense challenge. Astronomical methods, such as observing the positions of the moon and stars, were complex, weather-dependent, and required highly skilled navigators and accurate, bulky tables. The alternative, a reliable shipboard clock, seemed almost fantastical. Clocks of the era were notoriously inaccurate, susceptible to the rolling of the ship, changes in temperature, and the corrosive effects of sea air. A clock that could maintain accuracy to within a few seconds a day over months at sea was considered an impossible dream. Yet, it was this seemingly boring pursuit of mechanical precision that would ultimately lead to the widespread adoption of Greenwich Mean Time. The Royal Observatory, established at Greenwich in 1675 by King Charles II, was conceived for the express purpose of finding out the longitude of places and perfecting navigation and astronomy. Its first astronomer royal, John Flamsteed, dedicated his life to meticulous stellar observations, compiling precise star catalogues that would be essential for lunar distance methods of determining longitude. However, the observatory's most enduring legacy would ultimately be tied to time itself. The initial work at Greenwich involved establishing a precise local time based on astronomical observations. This was not a quick or easy task. It required regular, painstaking observations of the transit of stars across the meridian, an imaginary line passing through the north and south poles and the observer's zenith. Using specialized astronomical clocks, astronomers would record the exact moment a star crossed the meridian. These clocks, themselves marvels of early precision engineering, had to be painstakingly calibrated and regulated. Any minute error in their rate of gain or loss would throw off all subsequent calculations. The daily ritual of the Astronomer Royal and his assistants involved these precise measurements, followed by mathematical calculations to derive the exact time at Greenwich, the Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, named because it averaged out the slight variations of the sun's apparent motion throughout the year. This laborious process, repeated day after day, year after year, formed the invisible, foundational layer upon which the future of global timekeeping would be built. But how did this highly localized astronomical time, derived from the fixed observatory at Greenwich, become the universal standard, particularly when the very instruments needed to carry it across vast distances were still in their infancy? The journey from a localized astronomical time at Greenwich to a global standard was a protracted battle, largely fought on the high seas and within the workshops of a few obsessive, brilliant minds. The fundamental challenge, as posed by the Longitude Act, was the creation of a clock robust and accurate enough to keep Greenwich time reliably aboard a pitching, rolling, temperature-fluctuating ship, often for voyages lasting many months. While astronomical methods of determining longitude, such as lunar distances, were theoretically viable and championed by the astronomers royal like Neville Maskelyne, they required highly skilled navigators, clear skies, and arduous calculations. The dream of a mechanical timepiece, a sea watch, that could simply tell Greenwich time directly, was far more appealing for its simplicity and practicality. Enter John Harrison, an unassuming clockmaker from Yorkshire, whose relentless, decades-long pursuit of precision would ultimately solve the longitude problem and inadvertently lay the groundwork for GMT's global dominance. Harrison was not an astronomer, nor a man of formal scientific education. He was a craftsman, a self-taught genius who understood the intricacies of gears, springs, and pendulums like no other. His boring obsession was to counteract every variable that could possibly affect a clock's accuracy: temperature changes, friction, the varying pull of gravity, and the ship's motion. Harrison's early efforts, particularly his first 3 sea clocks, H1, H2, and H3, were mechanical marvels of their age. He introduced innovations such as the gridiron pendulum, which compensated for thermal expansion, roller bearings to reduce friction, and the bimetallic strip to regulate balance springs against temperature changes. These were ingenious solutions to engineering problems that had baffled the finest minds for centuries. The clocks were complex, intricate machines, each gear and pivot painstakingly crafted and adjusted. The constant testing, refinement, and painstaking observation of their rates of gain or loss formed the monotonous yet crucial routine of Harrison's life. He would run them for weeks, meticulously recording their deviations, then tear them down, adjust a minuscule component, and begin the test anew. This was the true, unglamorous labor of innovation: repetition, minute adjustments, and unwavering patience. It was with his fourth creation, the diminutive H4 chronometer, completed in 1759, that Harrison finally achieved the impossible. H4 was a radical departure from his earlier, larger designs. It resembled a large pocket watch, just 5 inches in diameter. Despite its size, it incorporated all of Harrison's cumulative knowledge and ingenuity, including a high-frequency balance, temperature compensation, and diamond pallets for minimal friction. The real test came during the voyage of HMS Deptford to Jamaica in 1761-1762. Upon arrival, after 81 days at sea, H4 was found to be only 5 seconds slow, translating to an error of less than 1.25 nautical miles of longitude. On the return journey, it performed even better. This was a triumph of mechanical precision, a direct, undeniable answer to the Longitude Act's challenge. Despite Harrison's undeniable success, the establishment, particularly the astronomical faction led by Neville Maskelyne at the Greenwich Observatory, was initially resistant to acknowledging his victory. They favored their own lunar distance method, which, while theoretically sound, was far more difficult and less immediate for a navigator at sea. The ensuing decades saw a quiet but persistent struggle between the astronomers and the chronometer makers. This wasn't a dramatic conflict, but a bureaucratic and scientific skirmish played out through reports, trials, and grudging admissions of accuracy. It was a tedious, unglamorous process of proving, reproving, and then slowly disseminating new technology. The ultimate triumph of the chronometer paved the way for the widespread adoption of Greenwich Mean Time. With reliable timekeepers at sea, navigators could simply set their chronometer to GMT before departure, then compare it to local apparent noon at their current position to determine their longitude. The simplicity and accuracy of this method eventually made it indispensable. As chronometers became more affordable and robust due to the work of other clockmakers building upon Harrison's principles, such as Thomas Earnshaw and John Arnold, their use proliferated across the British Navy and merchant fleet. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich, by continually refining its astronomical observations, provided the ultimate reference point for GMT. A signal from the observatory, initially a ball dropped from a mast, later a telegraph signal, would allow ships in the Thames and chronometer makers in London to set their instruments precisely. This regular calibration was the unceasing, boring work that ensured the accuracy of the global time standard. As the British Empire expanded, and as its maritime trade and naval power became dominant, the practical necessity of its ships and trading partners using a common time reference became increasingly apparent. GMT, initially a navigational tool, began its slow, inexorable march towards becoming a global standard for communication, commerce, and ultimately, our shared sense of elapsed time. But how did this British-centric time become truly universal, transcending national boundaries and scientific preferences to become the global reference point we know today? The evolution of Greenwich Mean Time from a specialized navigational tool into a universal standard was not a dramatic single event, but rather a prolonged, incremental process driven by practical necessity and the relentless march of technological innovation. While John Harrison's chronometer solved the longitude problem at sea, the more boring, yet ultimately more impactful step was the global adoption of a common prime meridian and a synchronized time system on land. This was a complex undertaking, involving international diplomacy, the burgeoning power of new technologies like the railway and the telegraph, and a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in how societies perceived and managed time. The widespread use of chronometers by the British Navy and Merchant Marine meant that, De facto, Greenwich became the primary meridian for their charts and navigation. As British global power and trade expanded throughout the 19th century, other nations, for pragmatic reasons, began to adopt British charts and, by extension, the Greenwich meridian. It was simply more convenient to use the dominant maritime power's reference point than to maintain one's own, which would require constant conversion. This commercial and navigational dominance laid the groundwork for a more formal adoption, though it was still far from universal. The true impetus for a synchronized global time came not from the sea, but from the land-based revolution of the railways. Before railways, local time based on the sun's position was perfectly adequate. A town a few miles east or west would have a slightly different local time, but this caused no significant problems for horse-drawn carriages or foot travel. However, with the advent of railway networks in the mid-19th century, these localized times became an unbearable logistical nightmare. A train schedule based on dozens of different local times across a single line was impossible to manage, leading to missed connections, delays, and even collisions. The need for a single, consistent time standard across vast geographical regions became acutely apparent. Great Britain, as the birthplace of the railway, was among the first to grapple with this problem. By the 1840s, railway companies in Britain began to adopt railway time, effectively standardizing their operations to Greenwich Mean Time. This meant that station clocks initially, and then town clocks adjacent to railway lines, started to show GMT, even if it differed by several minutes from their traditional local solar time. This was a slow, sometimes resisted change. People were accustomed to their local time, and switching to an artificial time, dictated by a distant observatory, felt alien. Yet the undeniable benefits of punctuality and safety for railway travel gradually compelled wider adoption. By 1880, GMT was legally adopted as the standard time across Great Britain. The invention and spread of the telegraph further accelerated the need for and adoption of standardized time. News, stock prices, and official communications could now travel across vast distances almost instantaneously. This meant that disparate local times created confusion and inefficiencies. A message sent at noon from London might arrive at 11:50 a.m. in Bristol if Bristol's local time was slower, or 12:10 p.m. if it was faster. For global communication and commerce, this was untenable. The telegraph provided the means to transmit the precise Greenwich time signal, allowing observatories in major cities across the world to synchronize their clocks to a common standard. This was the ultimate victory of mechanical precision and the boring work of observation, the ability to disseminate an accurate time signal across continents. The culmination of these factors led to the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. in 1884. Delegates from 25 nations convened to formally establish a prime meridian for global timekeeping and navigation. After considerable debate, Greenwich was chosen as the universal prime meridian, largely due to its existing widespread use in maritime charts and its association with the British Empire's global reach. The conference also established the concept of time zones, dividing the Earth into 24 segments, each roughly 15 degrees of longitude wide, with their time offset from GMT by whole hours. This compromise allowed for local variations while maintaining a clear, consistent relationship to the global standard. This formal adoption, while bureaucratic, was a monumental step, solidifying GMT's position as the world's time anchor. The legacy of GMT is immense and often invisible in our daily lives. It laid the foundation for coordinated global travel, communication, and economic activity. Every flight departure and arrival time, every synchronized financial transaction, across different continents, every precise scientific experiment, all ultimately rely on the framework established by GMT. It transformed a chaotic patchwork of local times into a unified, predictable system. The boring precision of astronomical observations at Greenwich, the decades of mechanical innovation by John Harrison, and the logistical demands of railways and telegraphs all converged to create this indispensable global utility. It stands as a testament to the fact that some of the most profound human achievements are born not of dramatic leaps, but of meticulous, persistent efforts to bring order to the mundane, to synchronize the seemingly disparate elements of human existence. What does the increasing precision of our modern timekeeping, driven by atomic clocks and satellite networks, tell us about our ongoing quest for order and synchronization in an increasingly interconnected world? From the ordered precision of global time, we now plunge beneath the bustling streets of Victorian London into a world of subterranean darkness, putrid effluvium, and the truly arduous, unglamorous labor that saved a city. This is the story of London's Victorian sewers. Not just their monumental construction, but the incessant, uncelebrated, and decidedly boring daily grind of their maintenance. These hidden arteries, a vital lifeline beneath the very foundations of the British Empire's capital, represent one of the greatest feats of public health engineering in history, a triumph born of desperation, scientific insight, and the tireless work of countless anonymous laborers. Imagine London in the mid-19th century. It was the largest, most populous city in the world, a vibrant hub of industry, commerce, and imperial power. Yet beneath its veneer of grandeur lay a horrifying reality, a catastrophic sanitation crisis. The River Thames, which bisected the city and was its primary water source, had become a vast open sewer. Generations of neglect, coupled with explosive population growth and the widespread adoption of the flush toilet, which merely diverted waste from cesspools into drains that emptied directly into the Thames, had turned the river into a fetid, reeking cesspit. Open drains ran along streets, overflowing with human and animal waste, refuse, and industrial effluent. Cholera, a terrifying waterborne disease, swept through the city in devastating epidemics, claiming tens of thousands of lives. The prevailing scientific theory of miasma, bad air, attributed disease to the foul smells. But regardless of the incorrect theory, the stench was undeniably unbearable. The summer of 1858 brought the crisis to a head in what became famously known as the Great Stink. A heat wave exacerbated the pollution in the Thames to such an extent that the stench became unbearable across the city. Parliament, located directly beside the river, found it impossible to conduct business. Curtains soaked in disinfectant were hung in an attempt to alleviate the odor, but to no avail. This profound discomfort, more than abstract public health concerns, finally spurred decisive action. The Metropolitan Board of Works, under the visionary leadership of its chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, was tasked with an immense and unprecedented undertaking: to construct a comprehensive enclosed sewer system for the entirety of London, collecting all waste and diverting it far downstream, away from the city's drinking water intakes. Bazalgette's plan was audacious in its scale and engineering brilliance. It involved building over 100 miles of brick-lined sewers, large enough in places to drive a carriage through, laid at precise gradients to ensure continuous flow by gravity. These intercepting sewers would collect waste from the existing smaller drains and transport it to massive pumping stations at Abbey Mills and Crossness, which would then lift the sewage into colossal outfall sewers that stretched for miles along, the riverbanks eventually discharging into the Thames at its mouth, far out in the estuary only at high tide. This was a project of truly colossal proportions, demanding unprecedented levels of capital, materials, and labor. The construction itself was a monumental, dirty, and dangerous enterprise. Thousands of navvies, the rough and ready laborers of the Victorian age, toiled ceaselessly, often knee-deep in mud, digging trenches, tunneling through unstable ground, and laying millions of bricks. Diseases, accidents, and exposure to toxic gases were constant threats. The sheer logistics of moving earth, transporting millions of bricks, and precisely laying the massive sewer pipes were staggering. This wasn't glamorous work. It was brutal. Back-breaking labor performed in often appalling conditions. Yet, it was the foundation upon which London's future health depended. Completed in sections over 2 decades, the new sewer system began to transform London almost immediately. The smell subsided, and more importantly, the cholera epidemic ceased. The system was a testament to Bazalgette's engineering genius, but its longevity and effectiveness were equally dependent on its maintenance. Building the sewers was one challenge. Keeping them functioning, inch by tedious inch, day after day, for over 160 years and counting, was another entirely. This was the truly boring history. The continuous struggle against blockages, corrosion, and the relentless accumulation of waste. But how, with the limited technology of the age, did Bazalgette and his successors plan to keep these subterranean lifelines clear and functional for the generations to come? Joseph Bazalgette while an engineering visionary in the design and construction of London's intercepting sewers, possessed an equally critical foresight. He understood that the longevity and effectiveness of his monumental system would depend entirely on its ongoing maintenance. He knew that once the sewage flowed into these subterranean arteries, it would require constant vigilance to prevent blockages, manage siltation, and contend with the relentless buildup of waste. This wasn't a task for engineers in drawing rooms. It was a job for legions of dedicated, hardy laborers, often working in unimaginable conditions. The very design of the sewers incorporated maintenance into its core. Bazalgette insisted on generous dimensions for his main sewers. Many were large enough for a person to stand upright, and some even for a small boat or a cart. This seemingly over-engineered approach was deliberate. It allowed for human access, crucial for manual cleaning and inspection. Had the sewers been too narrow, blockages would have been impossible to clear without extensive excavation from above, a process that would have caused constant disruption and immense cost. The smooth, brick-lined surfaces were also key. They minimized friction, allowing waste to flow freely, and made cleaning easier by reducing places for debris to snag. The precise, consistent gradients maintained throughout hundreds of miles of tunnels ensured a self-cleansing velocity of flow, meaning that the moving water itself would carry away much of the solid waste. This was a crucial design element, intended to reduce the need for constant manual intervention. Despite these self-cleansing properties, blockages were an inevitable reality. The sewers received not only human waste, but also rainwater runoff, street debris, and industrial effluent. Everything from grease and fat congealing from kitchens to discarded rags, broken pottery, and even animal carcasses. The primary method of dealing with these obstructions was, for decades, manual labor. Enter the flushers and the sewer gangs, the unsung heroes of London's underworld. These men, clad in heavy waterproof boots, canvas smocks, and often rudimentary headlamps, would descend into the sewers via manholes, equipped with shovels, rakes, and long wooden poles. Their work was unbelievably arduous and dangerous. The Bathhouses environment was suffocatingly humid, perpetually dark, and filled with the overpowering stench of raw sewage, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. These gases, produced by decomposing organic matter, were not only nauseating but also highly toxic and flammable. Methane could lead to explosions, while hydrogen sulfide could cause immediate unconsciousness and death. Early sewer workers often carried candles. A flickering flame indicated a lack of oxygen or the presence of dangerous gases, a grim warning system. Ventilation was primitive, relying on the limited air exchange through manholes and outfall points. The primary task of the flushers was to dislodge blockages and clear accumulated fatbergs, enormous masses of congealed cooking fat, wet wipes, and other non-biodegradable waste that would form solid obstructions within the sewer lines. This involved physically breaking down the fatbergs with picks and shovels, then raking the debris downstream to where it could be collected. In larger sewers, sometimes even boats or specialized barges were used to transport the collected sludge to the outfalls. This was a continuous cyclical process. A section cleared one week might begin to accumulate debris again the next, necessitating another round of laborious flushing. Another common method for clearing blockages was flushing gates. These were specially designed gates or penstocks built into the sewer system at strategic points. Water could be allowed to build up behind these gates, creating a powerful head of water. When the gates were suddenly opened, the surge of water would create a powerful flush, dislodging accumulated silt and debris further downstream. This was a sophisticated application of hydraulic principles, designed to mimic a natural flood to cleanse the system. However, even these required manual operation and careful timing, often performed by dedicated teams. The daily routine for a sewer worker was defined by grit and discomfort. Beyond the physical labor, there was the constant threat of disease from exposure to raw sewage, the risk of drowning in sudden flushes, and the psychological toll of working in perpetual darkness, amidst human waste. Yet, these men performed their duties with remarkable dedication, understanding the vital role they played in keeping London healthy. Their very existence was a testament to the fact that even the grandest engineering marvels required diligent, persistent human attention at the most granular level to remain functional. Their work was truly boring in its repetitive, unglamorous nature, but it saved countless lives by preventing outbreaks of disease. As London continued to grow and the demands on the sewer system intensified, the methods of maintenance also had to evolve. The simple shovels and poles eventually gave way to more specialized tools, but the core principle of manual intervention and meticulous oversight remained. The sheer scale of the network, miles upon miles of interconnected tunnels, meant that inspection was a continuous task. Regular routes were established for the sewer gangs, ensuring that every section was periodically examined for signs of damage, blockages, or structural integrity issues. This was a silent subterranean ballet of labor, performed away from the public eye, yet fundamentally shaping the very existence of the bustling city above. But what unforeseen challenges did this hidden world present? And how did the persistent efforts of these unseen laborers truly secure London's future for centuries to come? The long-term success of London's Victorian sewers, a testament to Bazalgette's foresight, lay not only in their robust design, but also in the unwavering generational commitment to their maintenance. The boring work of the sewer gangs, enduring the darkness, the stench, and the dangers, was the true guarantor of the city's health and prosperity. Their persistent efforts secured London's future in ways that were invisible to the vast majority of its inhabitants, preventing calamities that would have utterly reshaped the metropolis. One of the most significant, yet often overlooked impacts of this continuous maintenance was the prevention of epidemics. Before the Bazalgette system, cholera epidemics were a recurrent, terrifying feature of London life, decimating populations with horrifying regularity. The new sewers, meticulously kept clear, removed human waste from the city's water supply and atmosphere, directly interrupting the transmission routes of waterborne diseases. While the exact scientific understanding of germ theory only solidified after the sewers were built, notably with the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, the practical application of removing filth had an immediate and profound effect. The subsequent absence of major cholera outbreaks in London was a direct, undeniable consequence of the functioning sewer system and the men who kept it flowing. This silent victory, achieved through relentless, dirty work, saved more lives than any military campaign or medical discovery of its era. The maintenance efforts also allowed for the uninterrupted growth and expansion of London. Without a functional sanitation system, the city's population density would have become untenable. The continuous removal of waste enabled properties to be built and occupied without turning entire districts into uninhabitable cesspools. This facilitated economic development, allowed for the flourishing of commerce, and supported the burgeoning industrial activities that defined Victorian London. The sewers and their diligent upkeep were the invisible infrastructure that allowed the city to breathe, to expand, and to thrive, often literally, on its own waste. The convenience of flush toilets, once a public health disaster, became a boon only because Bazalgette's system and its maintenance crews efficiently removed the effluent. However, the job was never without its unforeseen challenges and grim realities. The constant exposure to methane gas posed a serious threat, not only from explosions but also from asphyxiation. Early sewer workers often suffered from chronic respiratory issues and other ailments related to their exposure. The psychological toll of working in perpetual darkness, often for long shifts surrounded by the effluent of a million lives, is hard to overstate. There was also the physical danger of being swept away by unexpected surges of water, particularly during heavy rains, or the risk of structural collapses in older or damaged sections of the network. These dangers were accepted risks of the profession, rarely discussed in polite society and certainly not glamorized. The fact that generations of men willingly undertook this work speaks to the dire economic circumstances of the time and the necessity of such labor. Over the decades, the tools and techniques evolved. While manual labor remained central, technological advancements gradually introduced more efficient methods. Steam-powered pumps replaced earlier, less powerful versions at the outfalls. Later, specialized vehicles and mechanical cutters would aid in breaking down stubborn blockages. But even today, much of the fundamental work still involves human inspection and intervention, particularly in the older brick-lined sections of Bazalgette's original network. The flushers of Victorian London have modern counterparts, navigating the same tunnels, albeit with better safety equipment and breathing apparatus. The legacy of London's Victorian sewers and the unseen labor of their maintenance is a powerful lesson in the critical importance of public health infrastructure. It reminds us that the foundational elements of a thriving society are often not the grand, visible monuments, but the hidden, painstakingly managed systems that deal with the mundane necessities of life. The story of these sewers is one of quiet heroism, of unglamorous dedication, and of a profound impact achieved through persistent, inch-by-inch effort. It demonstrates that true progress often lies in solving the boring problems, those that prevent catastrophe rather than create headlines. Today, as our urban centers face new challenges of aging infrastructure, climate change, and growing populations, the lessons of Bazalgette's sewers and the relentless work of their maintainers remain acutely relevant. They serve as a stark reminder that neglecting the hidden lifelines beneath our feet comes at a terrible cost. How much of our modern comfort and daily health do we still owe to the unseen, uncelebrated labor of those who manage the fundamental processes of our cities? And what forgotten, boring systems are we perhaps overlooking now, the future consequences of which will only become apparent to generations yet to come? From the depths of London's sewers, we now ascend to the bustling, sun-drenched chambers of the Ottoman Empire's administrative heart. A world built not on stone and iron, but on paper and ink. This is the realm of the scribe or khatib, a figure whose daily existence was defined by meticulous precision, endless repetition, and the pervasive scent of gall ink. Far from the grand narratives of sultans and janissaries, the true, boring history of the Ottoman state often lay within the quiet, methodical drudgery of its bureaucratic machinery. Powered by thousands of scribes whose ink-stained hands diligently recorded every decree, every tax, every transaction, and every minor dispute across a vast and diverse empire. Imagine Istanbul, the imperial capital in the 16th century, perhaps during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. The Topkapi Palace, with its intricate courtyards and imposing gates, served not only as the Sultan's residence but also as the nerve center of an empire stretching across 3 continents. Within its walls and in countless provincial administrative offices, Defterhandler across the Ottoman lands, resided legions of scribes. These were not romantic figures copying illuminated manuscripts in dimly lit monasteries. They were government functionaries, often working in large open halls, hunched over low desks, their quills scratching tirelessly across reams of paper. Their primary task was to create and maintain the voluminous records that were the lifeblood of the Ottoman state. The Ottoman Empire was, at its core, a bureaucratic empire. Its power rested not just on military might, but on its unparalleled ability to gather information, levy taxes, administer justice, and manage vast resources through a highly centralized and detailed system of record-keeping. Every land holding, every household, every soldier, every income, every expenditure, all were meticulously documented. This meticulous approach to administration was a key factor in the empire's longevity and stability. And it was the scribes, the khatibs, who were the gears in this massive administrative engine. A scribe's day would begin early, often before dawn, as they made their way through the narrow, winding streets of Istanbul to their respective offices. Their tools were simple yet essential: parchment or paper, a sharp reed pen, kalem, a small knife for trimming the pen, a pen box, divot for ink and pens, and most importantly, the ink itself. Ottoman black ink, typically made from gall nuts, gum arabic, and soot, was known for its deep, rich color and permanence. The scribes' hands, fingers, and often parts of their face would become perpetually stained with this ink, a badge of their profession. Upon arrival, the workspace would be prepared. Sheets of paper or parchment would be laid out, often with pre-ruled lines. The scribe would meticulously check their pen, sharpening its nib with their knife to achieve the desired thickness and fluidity of line. The inkwell would be filled, the ink carefully mixed if it had dried overnight. This preparation was not rushed. Precision in tools was paramount for precision in documentation. Every stroke, every character had to be legible, uniform, and consistent. The bulk of the scribe's day was consumed by copying, compiling, and recording. This could involve transcribing the Sultan's imperial decrees, firmans, registering land titles, compiling detailed tax registers, tahrir defterleri, that enumerated populations, agricultural produce and revenues, or drafting official correspondence. Imagine transcribing page after page of dense text, often in the complex Ottoman Turkish script, a blend of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish characters, with absolute accuracy. There was no room for error, as these documents carried the weight of imperial law and administrative authority. A misplaced comma, a miscopied number, or a smudged name could have far-reaching consequences, affecting tax revenues, land ownership, or even a person's legal standing. The work was mentally taxing and physically demanding. Hour after hour, the scribe would sit, often cross-legged or hunched, their eyes straining in the natural light filtering through the windows. The only sounds would be the rhythmic scratching of hundreds of reed pens, punctuated by the rustle of paper and the occasional clearing of a throat. There was little conversation. Efficiency and focus were paramount. Each document was a testament to the empire's meticulous administration, and each scribe was a vital, if unseen, custodian of that order. But how did the empire ensure accuracy and consistency across such a vast network of scribes? And what measures were in place to prevent forgery or error in this pre-printing press age? The sheer volume of documentation and the empire's geographical sprawl presented immense challenges for maintaining accuracy and consistency in the Ottoman bureaucratic system. In an age devoid of photocopiers, word processors, or standardized printing presses, the integrity of the state's records relied almost entirely on the diligence, training, and collective practices of its scribes. The Ottoman state developed a sophisticated, albeit boring in its meticulousness, system to ensure that the ink-stained hands of its katibs produced reliable and authoritative documents, a system built on rigid training, hierarchical oversight, and subtle checks and balances. Firstly, the training of a scribe was a rigorous and lengthy process. Aspiring katibs typically began as apprentices, often from a young age, learning the complex Ottoman Turkish script, which was a blend of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, written in the elegant Divani or Siakat styles. This wasn't merely about penmanship. It involved mastering the nuances of legal terminology, administrative jargon, and the specific formulas used in official documents. Apprentices would spend years copying existing documents, practicing their hand, learning the proper proportions of ink and water, and understanding the hierarchical structure of the bureaucracy. They learned not just what to write, but how to write it, the precise flow of the pen, the spacing of words, the proper way to sign and seal. This standardized training ensured a degree of uniformity across the vast scribal corps, making documents legible and recognizable regardless of their origin within the empire. Beyond individual skill, hierarchical oversight was crucial. Scribes rarely worked in isolation. They were organized into various departments, Defterhandler, literally register houses or archives, each with its own chief scribe, bashkatib, and a tiered structure of senior and junior scribes. Completed documents would often pass through several hands. A junior scribe might draft a document. A senior scribe would review it for accuracy and adherence to protocol. And finally, a chief scribe or a high-ranking official would append their signature or seal, conferring official legitimacy. This multi-layered checking process, while laborious, served as a vital safeguard against errors and deliberate manipulation. It was a tedious chain of command, but one that instilled accountability and ensured that every document had been thoroughly vetted before it became a part of the imperial record. Standardization of format and language also played a key role. Imperial decrees, tax registers, and legal judgments followed strict templates and rhetorical patterns. Scribes were not encouraged to express individuality or creativity. Rather, their skill lay in their ability to flawlessly replicate established forms. This consistency in format made it easier to compare documents, spot discrepancies, and trace the history of a particular landholding or legal case across different registers. The use of specific, often archaic terminology also acted as a form of security, making it harder for unauthorized individuals to forge documents without deep knowledge of the bureaucratic language. The very boring uniformity of the records was a powerful tool for administrative control. Furthermore, the Ottoman state employed subtle techniques to prevent forgery and ensure authenticity. Documents of significant legal or financial importance often contained unique identifiers, such as specific calligraphic flourishes or the precise placement of certain words, which were known only to a select few. The use of unique imperial seals, tura, intricate and difficult to replicate, was paramount for validating imperial decrees. Scribes, too, developed individual handwriting quirks, which over time could be recognized by their superiors, adding another informal layer of authentication. The meticulous record-keeping itself acted as a deterrent. A forged document could be cross-referenced against multiple registers and previous entries, quickly revealing inconsistencies. The sheer volume of interconnected records meant that altering one document without altering many others was nearly impossible without detection. The scribe's daily routine also involved the careful management of archives. Documents, once created, were not simply tossed aside. They were meticulously indexed, bound into registers, defters, and stored in vast, organized archives. These were not dusty, neglected corners, but active repositories, constantly accessed for legal disputes, tax, assessments, and historical precedent. The organization of these archives, often by geographical region, subject matter, or chronological order, was itself a monumental administrative task, requiring dedicated personnel who could navigate the labyrinthine records with speed and accuracy. This physical management of paper, the painstaking process of creating and retrieving documents, was another unglamorous but essential aspect of the scribe's world, a constant dance between creation and careful preservation. The lives of these scribes were characterized by quiet diligence and intellectual rigor, though their work might seem tedious to a modern eye. They were the silent architects of the Ottoman state's longevity, their ink-stained hands literally shaping the empire's administration. Their precision, their adherence to protocol, and their collective efforts ensured that the empire's vast bureaucracy functioned with remarkable efficiency for centuries, collecting revenue, administering justice, and deploying resources across an immense geographical area. But what became of these dedicated record keepers as the empire itself began to wane? And how did their centuries of meticulous work ultimately shape the historical understanding of a fading imperial power? The meticulously documented world created by the ink-stained hands of Ottoman scribes, while a testament to the empire's administrative prowess, eventually faced the immense challenges of a changing global landscape and the internal pressures of a sprawling, multi-ethnic state. The decline of the Ottoman Empire from its zenith was a protracted and complex process, and the fate of its vast bureaucratic machinery, including its legions of scribes, mirrored this slow, often painful, transformation. The endurance of their work, however, provides an invaluable, if boring, window into the empire's ultimate fate. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the Ottoman Empire began to experience a period of stagnation and decline. Military defeats, economic shifts, and growing corruption started to erode the highly efficient administrative system that the scribes had so diligently maintained. The sheer volume of documents continued, perhaps even increased, but the efficacy of the bureaucracy began to wane. Scribes, once a meritocratic class recruited for their skill and loyalty, found themselves increasingly subject to patronage and nepotism. The precision and integrity that had characterized earlier generations sometimes gave way to complacency or even deliberate obfuscation. The very nature of their work also started to become a hindrance in a rapidly modernizing world. The manual process of copying and compiling documents, while meticulous, was incredibly slow. As European powers embraced innovations like the printing press and more streamlined administrative techniques, the Ottoman bureaucracy, with its reliance on handwritten records, struggled to keep pace. Information flow was sluggish, decision-making processes were cumbersome, and the ability to adapt quickly to new challenges was hampered by the sheer weight of its own paper-based system. The boring efficiency of centuries past became a source of rigidity, ill-suited for the accelerating complexities of global politics and economics. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Ottoman scribes is profound and enduring. Their centuries of meticulous record-keeping created an astonishingly rich and detailed archive that is unparalleled in its scope and depth for any pre-modern empire. The millions of documents preserved in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, Ankara, and elsewhere provide an extraordinary granular insight into almost every aspect of imperial life. Land ownership, taxation, judicial proceedings, military campaigns, trade routes, daily life in provinces, demographic shifts, and even individual petitions and grievances. This vast repository of boring administrative data allows modern historians to reconstruct the Ottoman past with remarkable fidelity, providing nuances and details that would otherwise be lost to time. It is through these very documents that Scholars today can trace the subtle shifts in the empire's economy, analyze changes in its social structure, and understand the lived experiences of its diverse populations. The precise tax registers, for example, allow historians to map agricultural output, population movements, and the economic well-being of entire regions over centuries. The judicial records reveal the everyday disputes, the legal customs, and the application of justice at the local level. Without the relentless, often anonymous toil of the Katibs, much of this invaluable historical data would simply not exist. Their drudgery became the bedrock of future historical understanding. The transition from a handwritten bureaucracy to a more modern, printed, and eventually digital system was slow and protracted in the Ottoman Empire, accelerating significantly. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the empire attempted various modernization reforms, Tanzimat, the role of the scribe gradually diminished, replaced by printing presses, typewriters, and new administrative roles that required different skill sets. The elegant Divani script, once the hallmark of imperial authority, faded from common use as more standardized, simpler scripts, and eventually the Latin alphabet in the Turkish Republic, became prevalent. The story of the Ottoman scribe, then, is a powerful illustration of how the seemingly mundane mechanics of administration underpin the grand narratives of empires. Their ink-stained hands, working in quiet diligence for centuries, did not wield swords or command armies, but they nevertheless laid the bureaucratic foundations that enabled the Ottoman state to function for over 600 years. Their work reminds us that the power of a state is not just in its visible might, but in its invisible capacity to organize, record, and manage information. It underscores the enduring value of meticulous record-keeping and the quiet heroism of those who dedicate their lives to such tasks. As we navigate an age of unprecedented digital information and automated bureaucracy, what fundamental, boring processes are we relying on today, the preservation and understanding of which will be crucial for future generations trying to comprehend our era?